why is all this relevant? As we look back 150 years, what makes this all important to us here, today, and now? Well, for the sake of discussion, argument, whatever you want to say, let's use my background as a example of why this is so relevant. I graduated from college in 1981, and I wanted so bad to get a job with Xerox. There were a couple of companies back in the day that really pioneered sales training. Believe it or not, before that, it really did not exist. So there were a couple of companies. You had IBM, you had Kodak, you had Xerox. I mean, there were a few companies, and I wanted to get a job at Xerox because it was like getting your master's degree in sales. And I graduated from college in 1981, and they sent me off to Leesburg, Virginia. I go to Leesburg, Virginia, and I mean, beautiful. It's almost like a college campus. In fact, it wasn't almost like, it was exactly like a college campus. I mean, it had everything. It even had a gym and a cafeteria. I mean, it was just beautiful. And they were going to train us to sell copiers. Now, in 1981, when they were going to train me to sell copiers, they wanted me to be successful immediately. They weren't training me for some future sales opportunity. They were training me to sell now. And I mean, they hoped I sold a copier on my way home on the airplane. So they developed this program, and they want me to be successful right then and there. Well, if they were training me in 1981, they didn't invent that program in 1981. They developed it over a series of years. And if you go back kind of historically, when Xerox became maybe what a Microsoft became in the 80s, what Xerox was in the late 60s and 70s was that stock we wish all of our parents had bought to us and willed to us. We would have all been rich if that had happened. So they developed this program not in the 80s, but in the 70s. I mean, they didn't develop it the weekend before I got there. They've been developing it over time. So I go to Leesburg, Virginia, and I'm going to get sales training in the 70s. Now, when I went there to get trained, they wanted me to be successful right away. Well, I had a little bit of success. So then I became a sales manager. Of course, then, I trained my people the way that I was trained. I moved up. They moved up. How would they train their salespeople? The same way they were trained. So the reality is, much of this sales training has replicated itself over the years from one sales generation to the next, to a decision maker that we no longer call on. So let's take a look at this for a second. If this training was developed, let's call it the 70s. Let's call it 1970 for the use of math, okay? If we look at that, I'm going to give you kind of three truisms of what a decision maker looked like in 1970. And then we're going to break out, and you're going to create an entire list of how else we would create a profile for this decision maker. So let's take a look. In 1970s, okay, overwhelmingly so, I don't want to speak in absolutes, but overwhelmingly so, decision makers were male. Okay? There was mostly it was a one-income family, so most of the folks out there working in decision makers were male. Okay? Secondly, and we could do the math, is that if you were a decision maker in 1970, you were about 50 years old. Okay? And the reason why is because you missed some years because of the war. So you were in your 50s, 50-ish. Okay, so just to use the math, if you were a male and you were 50 years old in 1970, you're born in 1920. Now, there's something that we know about all healthy males born in 1920, and that would be they went off to World War II. Now, these are three truisms about the overwhelming population of decision makers that I would have been trained to sell to. And frankly, it did work. These folks were still out there making decisions. But in order to understand how we're going to sell moving forward, I think it's really important that we generate a profile of what kind of prejudicially or what kind of historic decision maker we have been taught to sell to and what kind of decision maker exists today. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you to take these three things, think about decision makers in the 70s, and let's write down literally everything we could think of that might describe them. What did their family life look like? What was their educational background? How did they buy things? How did they make decisions? As much as you can, write down as many things as comes to your mind about that, and then we're going to come back and we're going to take a look at that as it relates to decision makers today. Okay? Take a moment, write down everything that comes to your head.